Hello and welcome back to, for the very first time to the channel, I'm William Gwynne, and today we have a very special, exciting video. This is the first collaboration that I'm doing on my personal channel, and so thank you so much to all the booktubers who you are going to hear from imminently as they talk about their favourite read of the year so far. There have been some technical difficulties getting this video finished, so this is actually what the booktubers' favourite read was by the end of May, so it may have changed if they've done some of their kind of yearly wrap-up so far, and so yeah, that's why some of them may be different, but enough of me yapping on. You are here to hear from the booktubers, and so let's get right on into it.
Hi Will, thank you so much for the invitation. So my favorite pick for my favorite book of the year so far, and I've read plenty of great books in the first 3 months of this year, but if I have to choose just one, I will have to choose The Will of the Many by James Islington. I know The Will of the Many is not out yet. It's slated to be released on the month of May, but this is a Roman-inspired epic fantasy with a magical school or magical academy trope. I love it so much. I think it is the best fantasy book with a magical school trope I've read since The Name of the Wind. It is that good, and this is a contender for my favorite book of the year.
Hello, this is Matt from MattsFantasyBookReviews, and my favorite book that I have read so far in 2023 is not super easy for me because I have read some amazing books so far. I feel very lucky that I've got to read these, but definitely my number one has been The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu. It is the first book in the Dandelion Dynasty, and for me, it's the second best fantasy book that I have ever read in my entire life. The first being The Crippled God by Stephen Erickson, but I read that years ago. The Grace of Kings is just amazing. And it's certainly not for everybody. Oh, was it a book for me? Because it felt like a history book, because it does kind of follow the history of the Han Dynasty back in ancient China. But it's done in a different way, and it uses new characters, it goes into tremendous depth, because we don't have that depth anymore, it happened so long ago. But it uses these kind of real events to tell this incredible story. And it does it with this plot device that I can't get enough of, where it jumps from action point to action point with no letdown in between. You know, you'll have characters that are saying, you know, let's make this plan of action and let's go do it. And in most books, you're going to find that it takes you chapters and chapters to finally get to that point. Not in this book. They'll go to the next paragraph and go, yep, so here we are, we're doing it. It's awesome. It is balls to the wall, exciting, wonderful, and I cannot recommend it enough.
Readers, reviewers, I'm doing this video for Will's channel. Whatever. Alright, I can do it. Anyway, my favourite book of the year is Panther in the Sky by James Alexander Thom. Now, this is a historical fiction book set in the 18th century, focusing on the Shawnee chief Tecumseh. And this is the only book really that's ever made me feel like I'm reading Braveheart. But this book is far from the medieval Scottish borders. This is focusing on Tecumseh, the Shawnee chief. This is a coming-of-age, almost chosen one book, focusing on this character, this remarkable man in history. And his journey, his life, was utterly amazing, and it is a compelling read. Now, you have characters here that really you get behind, that you absolutely fall in love with, that you feel like you know them, that you feel like you are part of this world as well. The immersion by James Alexander Thom is just absolutely top-notch. His prose is beautiful, and it takes you to the cinematic place of America. All good historical fiction makes you want to find out more about the time period, and that is exactly what this book does. There is amazing action set pieces. There are these beautiful quiet moments where characters fall in love with each other. They fall in love with their own culture. They fall in love with the landscape and the world that they are in. And it is a beautiful book. It is also a heart-wrenching book. If you know the history of Tecumseh and the Shawnee, then you will understand why. But if you don't, then read on, please, because this is a beautiful book, one that will stick with you for a very, very long time. Thanks for watching the video. All on me, all on my own. Back to Will.
Hi, I'm Abby from the channel AbbySalter. Thank you, Will, for having me on to gush about some of my favourite books of 2023 so far. So I've got a couple to talk about, which are pretty much polar opposites of each other. They're both in the fantasy spectrum, but polar opposites when you think about fantasy. So the first one being Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett, which is a cosy, light academia romantic story following Emily Wilde as she journeys to a remote Nordic island to investigate the fairies there, and her academic rival, Wendell Babbleby, finds himself there as well, and it is their dynamic together as they investigate the goings on this island and the fairies there, and I adored it. I found it so cozy. I was really rooting for the romance, figuring out what was going on with the fairies, with the townsfolk, and really thoroughly enjoyed this cozy, happy book. Opposite to this, I also really thoroughly loved and enjoyed and surprised me was The Tyranny of Faith by Richard Swan, which is the second book in the Empire of the Wolf trilogy. This was a surprise because I liked the first book but didn't love it, and this really stepped it up for me. In the first book, we're following Conrad von Volt, who is a justice in this empire, so he goes from town to town meting out justice, and we follow him through the perspective of his assistant Helena as they investigate a murder in a small rural village. But things are much wider than that. There are many more things going on, and I really thoroughly enjoyed this second book, where we got into more of the meat of things, where we journeyed around more of the empire, got to see the capital, got to see more of the dark necromancy and the horror elements that were touched on in book one. Really thoroughly loved this second book in this trilogy. So those are two of my favourite books so far for 2023. I know, vastly different, both in terms of content and cover. Thank you again, Will, for having me on to gush about some of my favourite books.
Hey, Will, Andrew's Wizardly Reads here, and I just want to say thank you for asking me about a couple of my favorite reads of 2023 so far. I think I've got two absolute bangers here to talk about. And starting off, we have got John Palladino's The Trials of Ashmount. This is one of the darkest books I have ever read, but it has got a lot of emotional depth, a lot of hard-hitting moments, a multi-POV structure, very interesting magic system, deep, dark characters, fights for redemption, fights for revenge, fights for survival. It's just so good. I initially thought this book was going to be too dark for me, and then I couldn't put it behind me, and so I came back and I read this book, and then I was just so engrossed that it just pulled me in, made me want to read it, and it would not let go until I was done. So that's the first book that I really want to talk about, John Palladino's Trials of Ashmount. The second is a sequel, and that is No Port in a Storm by Cal Black. This is Legends and Legacies, book number 2. And here, this is a follow-up to No Land for Heroes, which is, of course, book 1, which was a fantasy western. And then book 2, No Port in a Storm, kind of shifts into a gas lamp fantasy. And here we kind of get to explore relationships and PTSD and trauma with a little bit of voodoo magic in a Louisiana bayou setting with elves. It's just, we've still got our gunfights. We've still got everything that made No Land for Heroes book number 1 absolutely amazing, but we just get to dive in to the minutia of Mildred Barry, who is the Bayou Butcher. From book number 1, we get to just explore her relationships, explore her motivations, her history, and everything that she needs to kind of tackle and address. And it's just fantastic. I love both of these books, and I don't think you can go wrong with either read.
And so I thought I'd quickly say what my favourite read of the year so far is. It was so difficult to choose, but I settled with True Grit. This is an incredible western, the first western that I've read since The Sisters Brothers, which I read many years ago now. And yeah, True Grit is a film I've loved, and so I've read the book material, and I absolutely loved it. I'm the third Gwyn to now fall in love with this book, and I've done a short review of it on the channel, and yeah, I recommend it to everyone, no matter the genre. It transcends genre for enjoyment, because it's got those characters, it's got heart, and it has an incredible story. And so yeah, perfect for basically anyone.
Will, as much as I'm thrilled and honored to have been asked to participate in this and tell you what I think so far is my favorite book of 2023, you've put me in quite a predicament, because if you don't already know, I've had the best experience this year that I've had ever in my life probably, and in the last few months I've uncovered multiple books that I've put on my list of all-time favorites. In fact, I've recently read what I consider to be my definitive now favorite fantasy book of all time. That one is A Storm of Swords by George R.R. Martin. book 3 in A Song of Ice and Fire. However, I'm going to echo the same sentiment with tons of other people. So I'm going to do something a little bit different and choose something else. The book I'd like to choose also became an instant favorite when I read it, and in fact, I enjoyed it much more than I thought I would. This one is Legend by David Gemmell. This is his first published novel, and it kicks off what is to later become the Draenei series. I enjoyed this one a lot. It left a lasting impact on me, and I think about it a lot. There are a few reasons why I think it's so special. First of all, it was written as a short, sweet, standalone fantasy novel, which is also always welcomed in the genre. And what it manages to do in this short package is really impressive. We basically have a 1980s classic heroic fantasy with this retired, grizzled old warrior that comes back for one last siege, one last battle to help these people, motivate them, and fight off this huge invading enemy force against what seems to be like no hope and just insurmountable adversity. And you have a ton of themes and metaphor and meaning woven throughout the plot, most of which stems from the author's existential crisis and cancer scare that he was dealing with when he wrote this. I want people to read this and hopefully enjoy it in the context of knowing a little more background and the story behind the story, because it really does hit differently. Druss has become a top 10 favorite character of mine. I think the dialogue is witty and fun, and this book has a ton of heart. And I just appreciate it for changing my opinion on what I thought classic fantasy and sword and sorcery could be, and introducing me to who I know is going to be one of my top favorite authors of all time, and that's David Gemmell. I've already started the prequel. I'm loving it. So I just wanted to get a little bit more light on this one. For those of you who haven't tried it, I would highly recommend this one as a favorite of mine in 2023.
First of all, thank you so much to Will for asking me to be a part of this collaboration. Asking a book lover what their favorite books are is just an impossible question. But if I have to pick two that are my favorites so far this year, I'm going to pick two that are actually pretty different from each other. So the first one is going to be A Song for the Void. This is a book that I read for the Spiffbo 8 competition. I was a judge over on Before We Go blog. And I've recently started to get into horror in recent years. I would actually just say in the last year-ish. And this is a cosmic horror meets grimdark fantasy book about a main character who's a doctor on a ship in the middle of a war. And the people on the ship start to slowly go insane, and things get a little crazier, a little crazier, a little creepier, little by little, as this doctor tries to find out what's actually going on. And I found that cosmic horror is something that I really enjoy. So I loved the combination of those two here. The second book that I've just adored so far this year is Tress of the Emerald Sea, also known as Secret Project 1 from Brandon Sanderson's Kickstarter. I loved this book. It was just exactly what I needed in my reading life right when I needed it. So it's got a very tongue-in-cheek, princess bride, kind of snarky narrative voice, and it's very fairy tale adjacent, but it's a fairy tale that's very self-aware and knows what it is. But the world building is gorgeous and lush, and I find myself thinking about it even couple weeks after I read it, and I can definitely see myself going back and picking this up.
Hi, I'm Ben from BooksWithBenghisKahn. I'm thrilled to be invited on to chat about two of my favorite reads from the first quarter of 2023. And I have two that were utterly gripping, but in very different ways. One from the beginning of a series, one towards the end of a series. And I'll start with that one. That is Tiamat's Wrath by James S.A. Corey. It's Ty Frank and Daniel Abraham co-writing this. Book number 8 out of 9 in the Expanse series. And this is just a roller coaster ride. Our band of protagonists are in a very sticky situation, and you just do not understand how they can possibly pull themselves out of it, or if they will. And when those scenes start to happen that are climactic moments, they are just so tense and suspenseful and cathartic and tragic and thrilling. Yeah, I felt just about every emotion reading this, and to top it all off, there was a new POV introduced that is a teenage POV who's one of the most interesting, complex teenage characters I've ever had the pleasure of reading, and brought a real breath of fresh air to the series at this late point. So just a fantastic, fantastic late series book that was just perfect for me in every way. My other favorite read so far this year has been A Clash of Kings by George R. R. Martin. That's book 2 in A Song of Ice and Fire. I watched the show years ago, and now that I've given myself lots of distance from it, I've finally dived into the books, and I couldn't be happier with the writing and experiencing this story in such a different, richer way for me. And I had a blast. This is a much slower paced book than Tiamat's Wrath, but just as immersive and gripping in its own way. The sense of place that you get being in so many different locations, and the characters are so split up. And with each POV, I was enraptured by their individual situations. There was not a single POV character that I got bored reading, and there's not a single complaint I had about this book either. It's actually hard to choose between this one and A Storm of Swords, which I read right after, and Fire and Blood also, which I truly loved. But in terms of how gripped I was to the narrative events and characters, I think this one wins out for now of my Song of Ice and Fire journey. So yeah, thanks for having me on.